Hello, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy. And today with me again is Mike Wang, my good friend and podcast co-host. We're not doing the podcast today. We're just hanging out. In fact, maybe that's something we talk a bit about today is that season 2 of the podcast is pretty close to wrapping up. And what do we do next? I don't know. We didn't pick a topic. So anybody here in chat, feel free to ask questions, guide us. This is just a free form kind of thing. We were just talking about Halloween and how we wish the hours were earlier.
Yeah, I'm 40 now, and I remember the excitement around Halloween. However, I never realized how big of an annoyance I was as a young preteen going up to houses.
Yeah, there is definitely, I think that's, for me, that was a very I'm old now moment is when I first started getting annoyed by teenagers in public. Because I work with teens, and so do you. We work with kids. We like them. Part of the reason that I do well with them is because I treat them as individuals. I don't write them off as they're just teens. But there are sometimes in public, especially in groups, when there are teens doing things. I'm like, oh, you teenagers, you youths.
Yeah, as a former teenager, it's weird. When do we reach that point where it's like, oh, wow, that doesn't make sense anymore, the way that I used to do stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I definitively remember that sense of look how cool I'm being with my friends by being, by saying something surprising or whatever, trying to be funny by doing something unexpected or whatever. And now when I see teens do it, I'm like, okay, we've all done that. It's not so unexpected, but at the time it felt so unique and cool.
Is anything that teens do these days ever actually original? Hey, we just got a message on our little machine here for the streaming that looks like Twitch might be having some trouble connecting. So some of our audience members that are coming from there, bear with us.
Yeah, I don't know. Remove and re-add it. I'll try that. Because I know a lot of the people that tend to chat tend to come through Twitch. So, because a lot of people watch this, and if anybody here is doing this right now, a lot of people watch the stream but don't comment in the chat, which is great. That's the whole point of this thing is we want it to be free and low barrier to access, including that you don't need to log into a chat. You don't need to write anything. You can just observe, but also know that you're welcome to. And especially if you go through, so Facebook, obviously will use your Facebook account and most likely has your real name attached to it. YouTube uses your Google account, your Gmail account, but Twitch uses your Twitch account. So you can you can make an account on any of them, I suppose, but Twitch is probably easier to make an anonymous sounding name if that's a concern.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we'll just talk about how silly we feel we were when we were teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
No, actually, this is something. I always want to talk about a million things, but since this is what we're on, my ADHD brain, I do think about development a lot like that because adults, parents especially, will often say things like, I know all teenagers are like that, I know, or the terrible twos, right? Oh, when toddlers turn 2, they blah, blah, blah. And those things obviously are not universal and inevitable, even though there's correlations, right? The common wisdom wouldn't exist if there wasn't some reason for people to look more closely at whether 2-year-olds are behaving in a certain way. But I don't know. I try to think about, in the tech community, especially, they talk about first principles thinking, but that's not where it originates. That's just where it's very popular right now. The idea of ignore all the things, the answers that people have given you about stuff and start from scratch, from first principles, use the things that and build from there. And I like to do that with development a lot of the time of okay, let's ignore the fact that we all think of teens as being rebellious and just imagine I was seeing somebody be rebellious and ask why. What would I be looking at and why might that correlate to the teenage years across the board, or more likely to anyway?
Yeah, and I think back to what you've talked about in the past is that our brain likes to simplify it, and we lump everybody between the ages of 13 to 19 into one group and sort of generalize too, just out of efficiency.
Yeah, for sure. I always wonder about that because my brain does not think of 19 as a teenager. I think of 18 as the end of it, but does 19 mean teenager to you? I don't know what's most common there.
I don't know. When I think of teenager, I think of anybody that I serve. So anybody between like right around the cusp of 8th grade to a senior, whether they're a quote unquote super senior or not. I generalize think of that, and that's why I'm probably lumping 19-year-olds into it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A few of those. Hey, you talked about my ADHD brain's going all around. You just talked about the tech industry. You were featured on a chat last week, right? Or was it this week?
No, last week, last Thursday, I did a panel on, I was a panelist on a panel about neurodiversity in tech, which was an interesting experience for sure, and an important topic, I think, because I think diversity obviously is important no matter what. Like we've done a lot of that on the podcast, not just. To me, it's really important to help people to understand that diversity isn't important because it's a morally good thing to do or some kind of charitable, like, oh, we should, work harder to include different kinds of people, but actually intrinsically beneficial for any group of people, whether it's a company or a school or just anything. The more diversity you have within that group, the more ideas and information and perspectives and whatever you have access to. The more you and I have in common, the more it is that when we're presented with a problem, we're going to come up with fairly similar solutions. And if mine doesn't work, yours probably won't either. Whereas the further apart we are, if mine doesn't work, yours is more likely to have a better chance,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that when you're talking about diversity like that, my training as a biology teacher goes back to, well, we know about monocultures. We know about the danger of not having variation within a population, right? And how that exposes us to be more vulnerable, especially when there are changes in the environment.
Yeah. I mean, and which really, like, evolution obviously is a thing that we tend to anthropomorphize, right? Like as though it has an intention instead of just a way of describing a series of events, a process. But to whatever extent evolution is like still that there's still selection pressure, I suppose, in the human species, it's almost entirely modified by society. Like things that obviously there are still health, physical conditions that make it so that people are more or less likely to survive and pass on their genetics and whatever. But a lot of that is really just like the more money you have, the better your chances are of doing those things. And the amount of money you have is very much dictated by societal expectations as opposed to like physical environmental ones. Mm-hmm. Not completely, but in a sense, that's what theoretically capitalism is supposed to be, right? That's the people who are fans of capitalism, which I'll be clear that I'm not. That's the idea, the thinking behind it is, free market, survival of the fittest, that the best things will thrive the most because, they are the best, right? They adapt or they're prepared for changing contexts. There's obviously problems with that, or at least I think so. And one of the big ones is that once you have power, you can utilize that power to make it so that even in a new context where your way of doing things is no longer the optimal one, that you can artificially make it that it's the optimal one. And that's super relevant, not just in, maybe we'll take it off of like economic theory and whatever, but like part of what we're talking about with teenagers, right, is, well, here's one story we could tell about a thing that might impact why teenagers tend to be rebellious is my parents worked their whole lives to like give me the best thing that they could give me, not just in terms of, resources, but also in the way they think and how they raise and interact with me and whatever. And that took their whole lives to develop after starting where their parents started them. And then they started me there. So now I'm doing the same thing and building on it and growing and improving and developing new things. So they went from 1 to 2 and I went to 2 to 3. And, my kids are going to go from 3 to 4, theoretically, hopefully, right? Right. They should have different ideas about things than I do. But there's going to be an intrinsic reaction to that as the person with the power to say, no, your new way is not better. It's actually worse, because then I don't have to like adapt and adjust and spend more of my resources. So it's a tendency for older people then to become very resentful of like, you're so ungrateful, like I worked so hard to figure this stuff out that I taught you and now you're telling me it's bad. It's like, yeah, because I wouldn't have been able to figure out that it was bad if you hadn't worked so hard to teach me that, and then I could move on to the next thing,
Right.
So I think it's interesting to think about it from that perspective, not the teenagers being rebellious because they're a teenager, which, by the way, for anybody who's watching and cares about these things, borderline personality disorder and bipolar and codependency, a lot of these things as well are like attempts to identify the source of a certain pattern of behaviors onto an individual, even when those behaviors only manifest within the context of a relationship. They're like, regardless of what you think about borderline personality, and there's certainly debate about that one more than most, no matter how valid you think that it is, or organic the condition is, or inevitable, or whatever, that person still doesn't behave the same way in every relationship with every person, right? That what the other person is doing impacts that, which doesn't mean it's their fault, but that's like we always talk about faultless miscommunication. But we started on tech stuff. we switch real fast.
We switch all the way around. I mean, I'm wondering. So we've moved from teenagers to my brain started thinking about this panel that you said on. What else? I mean, you talked about the importance of diversity. What else came up in that tech talk that you guys featured?
It was really interesting, actually, because there were 4 panelists, and all of us had they did a good job in putting together the panel. Everyone's unique, but I think they did a good balance of getting people who have enough, similar touch points that will be able to kind of work together and further each other's points, but enough diversity of thought even among the panel that it's not going to be friction free, that there is going to be pushback on like, wait, I don't think that what you say, like I get what you're saying, but I might blah, blah, blah. And it was really kind of cool to see, to be part of us all navigating that in a way that hopefully was still interesting and helpful. But the really my like biggest takeaway was something that I experience on the podcast all the time, and even right now, people want like easy, actionable things, and I want to talk about the reasons we arrive at those. I want to do those things too, but like if we only give you here, do this thing, it might work, it might not. If it does work, you only knew what to do because you were doing what I told you to do by rote. So if it's working, for example, and then it stops working, you don't tend to have a great ability to adapt it because you don't know how it was constructed in the first place. You're just doing it by rote. Kind of like in a play, if someone like memorizes their lines and then somebody else doesn't say the line that's supposed to prompt their line, they're like, I don't know, like in order to improvise in that way, you have to know the story and what you're trying to accomplish and the characters, not just the lines, Mm-hmm. But then, of course, if you do too much of that, people don't pay attention at the end. I think they did last time. This is just a general debate I have about how do we do enough complexity so that people learn why things work or how they're arrived at, not just to do it by rote. Plus, even if it does work, well, to whatever extent it works is because of me. It incentivizes you to come back to me because you did what I said and it worked. So if you want more, I'm the only place to get it, So it was a nice balance between a bunch of neurodivergent people on the panel talking like this, like getting further into complexity, and then a bunch of questions that were more like, okay, well, how do I change my hiring process in order to yada, yada. And I think we arrived at some good stuff, I hope, anyway.
That's interesting. But, a similar vein came up in a conversation today where I had a mom call me, said, hey, my kid's really not gelling with the math teacher, and she's always been successful in math. And I go, okay, tell me a little bit more about what do you think that it is? Is it the personality? Is it the style, the instruction? And what it came down to is that this kid just doesn't really care the teacher's super passionate about math. They're super passionate about like explaining how we came to understand why different formulas and sort of equations came to be. But the kid just doesn't care. They just want to be able to understand how to do the problem and then get it over with. And I think it's a misalignment of goals where the kid just wants the grade at the end and just wants to be able to say, I've done it and I can mark it as done. Whereas the teacher's like, I want to share all of my passion and love about it and give you all the context so that later on when you're finding yourself faced with other more advanced equations, that you understand where the root of all this came from.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's I think that's particularly a problem with math instruction, but it is a problem across the board in our educational system, even as you're talking about in cases where you guys do like one-on-one individualized instruction, because the whole structure of grading is, like we've talked about in the past, we're inserting measures into a thing. We're wanting to incentivize you to learn this thing because we think it will be beneficial to you to learn this thing. But as opposed to trying to convince you, or providing you evidence that it is worth learning, it's a much easier thing to create an artificial reason and just say you have to learn it for this reason. Yeah. But as we've talked about that Goodman's Goodhart's, and now I can't even remember, law of as soon as you select something as a measure, it ceases to be a good measure. Well, we've incentivized people then to just get the grade. And the most efficient way to do that, by the way, is something that a lot of students do and then feel very guilty about because they think they're not supposed to and other people don't do it this way, which is to just like cram the information at the last minute, pass the test, and then forget it all. Mm-hmm. It doesn't actually incentivize like long-term learning and development, just passing the test,
Yeah.
Which I know you guys aren't as, structured in that way. But really it originates in the idea that there's a curriculum that we determine ahead of time is going to be universally beneficial. All children should learn blank.
Right. And I think the challenge that we're working with this one child is that they sort of have these perfectionism tendencies where they, unless it's an A, unless I know that I'm getting this grade, then it's not worth it to me to do, or I'm going to keep ruminating on this until I perfect it. And it's just like, I just want to get it, and just give me the grade. Just tell me that I've gotten the answer correct. And that appreciation or that deeper understanding to come, it has to be a frame shift. I'm wondering how to work with the kid on this.
Yeah, well, honestly, that's a lot like what I'm talking about with the diversity stuff, right? Is like people are like, just tell me what I need to do to get the grade. Like, I don't really care about learning this in depth because, so here, I think we've talked about this before, but maybe not, that my framework of what a problem is, that a problem is something of which I am currently aware that is different than I want it to be. So there's 4 elements, 4 variables we can work on changing in order to resolve the problem. One is the extent to which I'm aware of it currently, because there are lots of things I know that are problems, but I'm not currently aware, so it's not a problem for me right now. The universal example there is death. Like we all know we're going to die. It's not a surprise, but we don't walk around thinking of it consciously all the time. And anytime we do, anytime something happens that makes us think of it, typically we're like, because we can't resolve the material conditions of the thing. We can't change the fact that we're going to die. We can't change our perception that we're going to die. All we can do is just become unaware of it, right? So that's how we solve the problem. So then the other one is the material conditions of the thing, because if those things change to bring it more in line with what I want, my perception will change along with them, theoretically. Another is my perception that even if it itself doesn't change in any material way, I perceive it to be more in line with what I want. And then the last is to change what I want to come more in line with what it is that I'm perceiving to be true. So with things like this, with things like the grading or approaching diversity from that way, even in a very noble, like it's not like people are morally bad. Even if you genuinely deeply care about, I want to do things that are right and helpful for other people. Well, the only way you can know what things are helpful for other people, what things are problems for other people, is for them to tell you about it, because it's not my problem. I don't exist. Like it's not that I'm unaware of it. It's just that I don't know it, just like I might know that I'm going to die. It's just you don't walk around living it and being aware of it all day long. Mm-hmm. So no matter what, when they make you aware of it, when your teacher makes you aware of the problem by making it an artificial, you must do it for this grade, well, we can resolve that a lot of different ways. One is to learn how to do the things the teacher's asking me to do for the grade. But I've said before, a lot of my grades I got just by convincing the teachers to give them to me, and there's no material difference at this point. You could not go back and look at my transcript. No one's going to remember. You could interview all my teachers. It's very unlikely that anyone would ever find out which grades I got because I charmed the teacher and which grades I got because I did the work, Mm-hmm. So anyway, to me, that's the thing, is what we need to do both in the case of diversity, but also in working with children like this, is if there is a thing I want you to do, the first way I'm going to be able to get you to do it is to make it a problem for you, to bring it to your awareness and help you to understand that it's different than you want it to be. But at first, that's only going to be something you're aware of when I'm bringing it to you. So you're going to always want me to stop bringing it to you. Not in a malicious way, but just like, I don't want to deal with this problem. Leave me alone, you know? But if I somehow am able to then make a connection for you about how the problem that I'm making you aware of is actually causing problems in your actual life, if I can make that connection for you, then I don't need to tell you about the problem anymore. Then you walk around and you see these things happening, or especially things you already consider to be problems, but now I've connected it to this new thing. I never have to try and convince you about it again, as long as you believe it. I can't just like trick you. It has to be, well, I suppose I could if I'm really good at tricking you or you're trickable, but most effective is to be authentic. Like, here's this problem and genuinely see it connected to this thing in this way.
Yeah.
In this particular, go ahead.
No. Sounds like the whole teach a man a fish sort of proverb, right?
Kinda. It's very much like a don't shoot the messenger kind of a thing, right? Like, if the problem's only a problem to you, if you're only aware of it when I'm making you aware of it, then I'm the problem. Even if you like me, even if you want to help me, you know, it becomes draining to you to have me around. And which is where we get, like, teachers actually are a great example of this. Not every single teacher, but many teachers who care very deeply about children and education. They love kids. They wouldn't go into it's not a profession you go into to like make a lot of money or, you know, have a very easy job or whatever. They go into it because they're passionate, but they still end up, you know, some of them becoming very resentful of individual children or children altogether. Because if what you're doing is aimed around, I'm solving a problem because you're making it a problem, you're making me aware of it as a problem. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm willing to do a lot, right? Even if I'm great and super, like, I'll do anything you tell me to do, but there's still a limit there, because once I finish doing everything I know to do and everything you've told me to do, if the problem is still a problem, I can't come up with new solutions because it's not my problem. I need information from you to be able to come up with more. So people hit a point at which they're like, you know what, it's on you now. What can I do? I can't make them want to learn. I can't make them want to come to school. I've done this, I've done that, I've done everything you can do. That nothing's going to happen until they want to do it, right? Yeah. And I'm not saying that's not fair. You know, it's just there's limits when you approach it as charity. I don't even remember how we got onto that.
I don't know. If you're just joining us, it's just Brandon and I hanging out. Please comment. Please ask some questions. Tell us what to talk about.
Yeah, so to answer your question earlier, for this specific thing of a kid, you know, that you want to get them passionate about math, what the teacher is doing is a great way to attempt to do that. It just hasn't worked. So let's go for the same thing in a different way, you know, find a different approach. But you have to make it a problem for them, not because of you, not because you're inserting it. So in this case, what the teacher is doing by being passionate and sharing all these things is going for a type of problem that I think is very hard to make people aware of, but very effective if you can, that I call lost benefit. Of like, it's not active. There's nothing happening in your life that is painful or just, you know, uncomfortable or unsustainable. But look what you could have if X or Y was different, right? Mm-hmm. Here's this great thing you could have that you're losing out on until this thing changes. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, with that passion, it's like, look how great and fun math is. Look at all this cool stuff. And the idea there, I mean, and good teachers do this a lot, right? Try and share their passion and make it fun so that the kids get into it, because then the kids say, yeah, I like this. If I were to stop doing it, that would create a problem for me because I want more of it, you know? But that particular way of trying to get them excited isn't working. But you can try different ways. In other words, one thing I will tell parents especially, but people in general all the time, is totally fine to ask people to do a thing without understanding why you're asking them to do the thing. We can't think deeply about everything, you know, get down off the table or whatever, you know, like, fine. But if the person then isn't doing it, if they give you, you know, any reason at all to believe that they, you know, are not going to do it just because you've made them aware of it, then your next step, most people's next step, is to escalate the first thing, shout louder or whatever. The next step should be this: you need to answer for yourself, why are you asking them to do it? because sometimes, like we were talking about development, right? There are a lot of things that we ask people to do because we learned to do it in a context in which it was important, but the context has changed and there actually is no reason to do it now other than that we're asking you to. So if I can't answer that question of why I'm asking you to do it, how am I supposed to get you to do it any other way than by rewarding you or punishing you? Even if that's just a reward or punishment of like, I will be happier with you or like you more if you do it, or be more upset if you don't,
Yeah.
And then if you can't answer why, then you can explain to the person why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do. This is extra important with neurodivergent people because so much, and especially in school, of what causes problems between neurodivergent individuals and their teachers is neurodivergent children especially will ask questions sincerely that are interpreted as an attempt to make a point, right? And this is a particular one that if I say, wait, why are we doing this? I might legitimately mean I need to understand the connection between what you're asking me to do and what we're trying to accomplish. Because without that, it just seems arbitrary and I don't really care that much about your approval, whatever. But that question, why are we doing this, often is interpreted as, I don't think we should do this. This seems dumb to me. Prove it. And then it's hard to answer the question when you interpret it that way.
Right. No, I think that helps. It helps frame in the conversation that, hopefully have with this kid, just sort of figuring out what's working, what's not working, and what.
So the process, and I got a comment of this with somebody's weekend with their spouse and daughter. Yeah. And like Mike said before, and I said before, you want to ask specific questions or throw specific things out there, please do. We'll talk about whatever, it's public. Don't put personal information and details out there.
Yeah, because if you leave me to it, I'm just going to ask school questions, but I'm sure you have the whole things that don't exist in a building. Or
there's a I don't know what you call it, a thing called neurolinguistic programming. It's kind of half a theory of therapy and half a, I don't know. Tony Robbins does neurolinguistic programming. It comes from these guys, Bandler and Grinder, I think, who were students of Milton Erickson, who I'm a big fan of. And they kind of took his work and really like commodified it. And so it's big, or at least it was, I don't know if it still is, big in like corporate circles. But the philosophy behind it all is very legitimate. It's just about how people tend to utilize it. And in a sense, it is kind of hypnotism. So what I'm trying to say is in neurolinguistic programming, what they'll say is connect to something they already like, right? And they have all kinds of tricksy ways of doing that work. But I think the best, what you want to do first, my rule is engage in areas of interest. It's a lot easier if you're trying to get somebody to do something. It's a lot easier typically to connect what you're trying to get them to do to something they already enjoy or already want than it is to give them reason whole cloth to engage in this new thing. So you find the kid's interests and then you connect those interests to what it is that he's being asked to do or she's being asked to do, they're being asked to do. And there's all kinds of ways of going about that. But if you think of it in terms of lost benefit, right, that like whatever thing they might be interested in. And again, this is not new. In fact, math is kind of an example of people will work through this stuff to get at the formula, and then people learn the formula without knowing the process underneath. So the formula we often arrive at is, connect, use whatever they're interested in. If they're interested in like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, has lots of math involved. Or me, the way that I love math. I never loved math until very recently. I love math now because I was never taught math in terms of, again, I think this is pretty common. People are taught math that it's about numbers and formulas. It's about being able to learn and memorize enough to identify what type of problem a problem is, identify what formula or what thing you're supposed to do in order to resolve it, and then execute it and resolve it in a very abstract sense. When really math is just a language. It's like any other language. It's a way of notating and observing events and playing with things, right? So when you put it that way, then to me, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, okay, I love that. You know? Like, I'll be happy to connect. Oh, you know, attention is finite. So if we spend 1 point over here, where's that coming from, kind of thing.
Yeah. You know, I'm curious with in our chat stream, HROX9. I'm wondering what this whole thing was this weekend between your spouse and your daughter. I'm battling here about math and the relevancy of it and why we're approaching it the way we are. But I'm wondering what you're dealing with at home.
Yeah, well, we wait for Atrox to put some, or anybody, and Atrox doesn't have to, but you know, part of the particular problem with math, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? They were long ago determined to be like the cornerstones, and we still do them for everybody. And there are definitely approaches to that. One of my good friends, really one of my closest friends, his name's Dr. Ross Sweet, is a PhD, a professor of mathematics. And his kind of work is in this field of mathematic education, you know, like how do we teach people to teach math, even though he himself is a very like advanced mathematician. It's applied in that way. Because math, like language, is applicable to anything, but we don't tend to teach it that way. We teach it as this, we silo it off. You know, you teach it as its own thing, as opposed to here's how you utilize it for whatever. So I'm not saying that not everybody needs to learn it. It's useful to learn, especially in logic. But now we have a comment, so let's do the comment.
Yeah. Says, husband, I'm assuming, he told her to stop a chore she was doing and get ready to leave without telling her that we needed to be somewhere at a specific time.
Yes, that's problematic. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but let's go with the one that we were talking about as it, you know, that prompted that original comment, which is to take questions as sincere rather than to ascribe intent that isn't displayed. Now, that's difficult to do because our brains, you know, like a related thing to this is people don't pay attention to the physical elements of what they consider to be intellectual tasks. So, for example, if I cleaned my desk yesterday when I, you know, would otherwise have been writing emails, right? I intended to write emails and I cleaned the desk instead. And then if someone were to ask, hey, why'd you clean your desk? The answer that most people would give would be something like, yeah, it's a way to distract myself from writing this email I don't want to write, or I got distracted or I lost focus, these like abstract concepts. And they leave out, not that those aren't true, potentially, but they leave out the more physical, like observable element of, well, I started cleaning my desk because I saw this particular thing and then it bothered me and I thought I could resolve it really quickly. But then when I did that, while I was doing that, the angle I had, I saw this other thing. And then I kind of started to get into a mode where I saw all the things. And, you know, when you ask people why they're struggling with writing, they will almost never, ever talk about typing or writing. They'll talk about, I just can't think of what to say, you know. So same here. We make assumptions in order to be efficient, which the brain wants to be. We give the bare minimum communication necessary to accomplish whatever it is we're trying to accomplish. And that rests on all kinds of assumptions. In this case, the husband didn't think it was necessary for whatever reason. His brain did not determine that it was worth paying attention to whether or not the time had been communicated. Perhaps because he was assuming that the daughter already knew the time, perhaps because he thought the time didn't matter, just get ready now and we'll go whenever. There's a couple other comments here now too.
Yeah. She insisted that she was in the middle of doing something and asked for clarification. He simply insisted that she needed to get ready and she didn't understand why. And then once I told her that we had a place to be at that specific time, she was ready to go in just a couple minutes.
Yeah. So especially neurodivergent people, and I don't know that your daughter is, but you know, that's what we talk about here. Especially neurodivergent people will often want to know why, because, well, you know me, I don't ever like to say definitively because, but one factor that I think is important to consider is we've tried doing all the things that we were told to do before, and then it didn't result in the things that people were saying it was supposed to result in. You know, someone tells me, hey, just, I don't know, write 500 words. And so I write a minimum of 500 words and I write 2,000 words. And then they're like, no, this is way too long. This is bad. but you told me write a minimum of 5. That's a minimum of 500, right? So over time, we learn, okay, people are telling us to do things, making assumptions that we are going to see or approach or do things in similar ways, or that the things that work for them or that work most commonly will work for us as well. And we have enough experience that no, that's not the case. And so that over time incentivizes us to say, don't tell me what to do. Tell me what we're trying to get at, because maybe what you're telling me to do is the best way for me to get there, but maybe not. And if you tell me what we're aiming for, then I can say like, oh, okay, I get that. That's fine. I'll do it this way. It will be better for me. And of course, we're not always right, but that the more someone tends to be outside the norm in one way or another, and particularly neurodiversity and education, the more incentive they have to ask why. It's sensical to ask why. Because I tried another great example I say all the time is when people say, just do your best. The intention of which is usually something along the lines of, don't stress about it too much, just do something and turn it in. But what do your best technically means is spend all your available resources working on this thing. If you stop working on it an hour before you could have, that's not your best. You could have, even if it's a marginal improvement. So every time people are saying, do your best, and then the kid still doesn't get it in or whatever, they think, I'm telling them just do their best. When really that's making it worse every time. Mm. So go ahead.
No, and I think I'm hearing maybe from the father's side of I had made these assumptions that my daughter knew exactly what was going to go on, and this is why she should have prioritized getting ready as a task rather than the chore that she was already engaged. In that it also takes the husband or the father extra energy and time consumed to be able to communicate that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm thinking about like flows of communication between two individuals, right? Like you've talked all the time. It's like I'm trying to communicate whatever's going on in my brain into another person's brain, and just learning that it takes that little bit of extra energy and effort to be able to have that other person understand what you're thinking.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that's such an important thing to call out. I appreciate you doing that, because that's what we were talking about earlier with the teenager thing too, right? Is it's very easy for people to approach this and say, oh, the girl's trying to do the bare minimum. She'll do it, but only if you tell her why. Well, so is the dad. He'll explain it in more detail if you tell him why that is beneficial. But if he doesn't know why, he's going to do the bare minimum. It's not a character flaw for either person. That is how all brains work. We do the minimum we believe necessary to get the results that we're going for. That's how it is. Yeah. Like, why would a brain do anything otherwise? It would be wasteful. And of course, we follow our interests in whatever, but we could break those down into terms of like, what are we going for? Is optimization in those ways. And the comment here, even we should get her tested to see where she is so we can be more effective with communication like this. Part of that is getting an answer to why should I do this more? That if I don't tell someone I'm neurodivergent, and I'm interacting with them in some way without that context, they might be very annoyed that I do what I do, or that they have to, I'm impacting them or requiring or asking them to do a certain thing. But then if I give a reason, oh, I have ADHD, then they'll say, oh, okay, sure. That's part of the benefit of getting a diagnosis. The brain does not do anything without a reason. Nobody's does. And that's why we put so much on the attention too, because even here, he thought she knew, but she hadn't heard because she had headphones on. If we assume that other people have paid attention to the same things we've paid attention to, are aware of the same things we're aware of, which is what the brain does, we make that assumption first, then that means that sometimes, we're going to do things. And that's why the faultless miscommunication piece is so important, because I didn't do anything wrong. It's a reasonable assumption to think that when I said the time, you heard the time. That wasn't true, but it's a reasonable assumption to make. And you didn't do anything wrong because you didn't know what the time was. It was just a miscommunication. So let's rectify it.
Yeah, this has got my brain thinking about a conversation that we had almost close to a year ago about when you're talking about spouses, longtime partners, having part of their memories live within each other, how we depend on each other. And just as an aside, this is complete an aside, I'm apologize for the departure. I told this story to my wife because I thought it was one of the sweetest things, talking about how we become dependent on each other. Some of my memories are in her brain, her memories are in my brain. I told her this, thinking it was the sweetest thing in the world. And that's why, when old people lose another person, it's like they've lost part of their brain. My wife took that as, wow, you're just compartmentalizing exactly where the socks are. Your socks are in my house. And she didn't think it was sweet at all. But I'm thinking, I'm thinking about this, and that the importance of communication, that we can't make assumptions that certain parts of that information and memory are living in other people. That's just where my brain went with this one, of like making that assumption that they just understand, and the only way that we can get through it is to be able to verbalize it and be able to communicate that more.
Yeah, I really like that concept. It's called transactional memory. The idea that and again, we can explore it in many different ways, because part of what we're talking about is specialization. You handle this stuff, I handle that stuff, which requires more communication. And the more someone learns about a thing, the less incentivized they are to pay attention to that thing. It's a huge problem in therapy. I imagine it's a huge problem in education and in other fields generally as well, is that the more you believe you're an expert on a thing, the more your brain says, okay, I only need a little bit of data, and then I can just run it against all the things I know in my head and come up with the effective, solution or strategy or whatever. Well, that applies to relationships too, that the more you believe that you know your spouse or anybody else, the less incentive you have to actually pay attention. And we talk about all the time about, taking each other for granted, and you got to keep it new and blah, blah, blah. Well, one thing that counteracts that is to specialize, because specialization incentivizes paying attention. Even if I believe I know you very well and very deeply, spouse of mine, well, if you're dealing with this stuff while I deal with this stuff, then every day there's new stuff, new information you have that I don't. So my brain, which is part of the reason that we see spouses as a good example of this, like at the end of the day, how was your day? That we check in with, give me the new information of your day. And sometimes spouses will get very distraught when they're like, I have no new information to share with you, because I feel like I'm boring you, or you're not interested in me, or whatever. But it's just a way of talking about what we're talking about. If you think you know everything about a thing, why would you keep paying attention? So that transactional memory, that specialization, is really good. That's how it should work. Now, there's a really good point and big problem here. Yes, to the person asking questions, you can ask questions here. In particular, in our culture, and I assume many, but I don't like to speak outside of my own knowledge, that the way that this has happened between men and women particularly, there's a lot of problems there in what things are your specialty and what things are my specialty. Especially in neurodivergent households, by the way, that when I used to work in like the gifted land community, which I do consider to be a form of neurodivergence, when the parents would bring in the kids, we'd always say like, okay, so where's the kid come from? Like they don't come from nowhere. Like what is your guys' experience with this kind of stuff? And 9 times out of 10, both parents would say, oh, dad's really like this too. Dad's really intelligent. When mom is just as intelligent, if not more so. Of course, a lot of this has a problem with, what is intelligence, as we've talked about. But moms tend to be forced into the role of the executive functioning brain of the home, of the family. That in that specialization, there's a reason to archetype that the nutty professor, the person who gets to focus so much on their work, that I get to dream and think of whatever, and everything else is a mess, is because his wife is, there's a reason that archetype is typically portrayed as a man. So there's problems here for sure. What we want to focus on is what I call equal exchange of energy, meaning it doesn't matter if in a given category, you and I each do half of it, because you're better suited to some things and I'm better suited to other things. That's fine. It's most efficient to go that way, but we just need to communicate a lot. Because if I'm working on my thing and I know you're not working on it, then what else am I going to see unless you communicate with me and tell me what other thing you're doing instead, or I ask you to do something else instead? All I know is I'm doing this and you're not. So my wife and I, we have like very ridiculous little trades where I pump gas into the cars. She eats the heels of the bread. That's our trade. We made that as a specific equal energy trade. I don't like the heels of bread. She doesn't mind it. She doesn't like pumping gas. I don't mind it. So we traded. And yeah, we want to keep checking in because we don't want to just categorically, yes, she's better at cleaning, and therefore, because there's all kinds of questions too about why is one person better suited, how they've been socialized. But any two people just got to work it out. You keep checking in. Ooh, I look like Dave Grohl. I like that. Thank you. I'm going for more Jason Momoa thing, but Dave Grohl is a good. I'll take that one too. Ooh, I love this question. I get a lot of diarrhea when I'm anxious. Any tips? I really love that question. I appreciate them putting this out there. I don't know if that's their real name. I'm guessing not, but I'm not going to say it out loud anyway. Because this kind of stuff, like, it's problems and people don't talk about it. A lot of the issues that actually talking about, marriages, talking about sex, talking about pornography, talking about, bathroom issues or bodily issues, anything that people think of as taboo or shameful or whatever and don't talk about tends to become more of a problem because communication helps solve the problems. So I appreciate you taking that risk and putting that out there. Tend to get a lot of diarrhea when I'm anxious. Any tips? So good noticing the correlation. The first thing that I would say is don't assume causation. And I know that you're probably not, but the way the question is worded implies because I'm anxious, I then get diarrhea. And that may be true. So I'm not neglecting that. We're going to talk about that. But first principles thinking, is it possible that there is something else that you are doing that is both more likely to give you diarrhea and make you anxious? Or is it possible that when you get diarrhea, you have a tendency to get more anxious? That because you have had this experience in the past, oh no, like I'm going to be stuck here for half the day. I'm going to be uncomfortable. And then I'm thinking about all the other things that's going to cause problems and I get anxious. But I'm going to go with my initial read of the question and assume that you have reason to believe that it's the other way around. Anxiety causes the diarrhea. Here's my best tip if that were the case. I have lots of tips in the other categories, right? Like looking at diet and whatever, and I'm sure you've learned all about those things. I got a couple here. One is schedule things. How to develop a better relationship with my own body. I can't look at my body without feeling bitter. Any tips would be great. Okay, good, because that's the second thing I was going to talk about. So the first is, develop a schedule. Just attempt to start to predict when you're going to need to use the bathroom and do it preemptively, as opposed to waiting until your interoceptive, sense is telling you it's time to go use the bathroom. Because it is possible, especially for neurodivergent people, that interoceptive sense is deprioritized, and so you're actually putting your body in a position where you're going to bathroom too late consistently, and that's causing issues, or too early because you're nervous about waiting too long or whatever. So try and develop a schedule with cues other than just your own sense of it, and you can do that along with other things that you think might be related, like what you eat and when. If you schedule that out, you can start to experiment with some things. Because it's also possible, for example, that you're just mildly lactose intolerant and don't know and whatever. But the second one is where I think we're going to get a little more out there, but correlated with the other question. We've talked about attention and awareness are finite resources. And what we can do then is paint categories around anything and say the more that you pay attention to this, the less you pay attention to that. And one thing we can do is mind and body. That the more you pay attention to your mind, the less you pay attention to your body. And a lot of different approaches we'll talk about, mind-body balance and yoga and things like that. Mindfulness is very big on this. We've talked about it in the past as real versus non-real, like paying attention to the physical environment, including my body, versus paying attention to the cognitive environment, memories and thoughts and imaginings and whatever. Well, anxiety, different people define it differently, right? But typically the experience of anxiety is both, that there's some physical feeling accompanied with a cognitive experience that you're combining and saying, oh, it's anxiety. That if you felt the same way physically, but with different thoughts connected to it, right? Like I get a feeling of expansiveness right under my sternum. I don't know how to describe it better than that. I get that same feeling if I'm really excited, and I get it if I'm really stressed. How I tell the difference is because of other things that are going on in tandem with that. So that's part possibly of what's going on here, is that part of what you're identifying as anxiety is in some way related to the feeling that is correlated to the diarrhea. Another way of saying it is most people, when they're getting very anxious, are very in their head. Anxiety is usually future focused, not based in the present environment. You're thinking about what might happen next, what you don't want to happen next, what went wrong before. You're thinking about other things, so you're more in your mind than in your body, which would mean that you're deprioritizing that interoceptive sense. You're paying less attention to your body. Even I have a hard, want to develop a better relationship with my body. I mean, there's lots of things there, right? Like gender dysphoria and fat phobia and all kinds of different things. But the way we're talking about it, the mechanical way we're talking about it, what it means on some level, for some reason, we can tell lots of stories about why your idea of what you should look like and what you actually look like don't match up in some way. And that's causing you distress, right? That your observation of your actual appearance versus your cognitive sense of either what your appearance is when you're not looking at yourself, this is what I look like. And then when you see yourself, how many of us like hear our own voice or see us in pictures and we're like, oh God, that's what I look like. Because our mental idea of it is different. I said either. I was going to say another thing and now I totally lost it. Either that it's potentially inaccurate, that you think you look different than you do, or you have an accurate-ish picture of what you look like, but you have a mental image of what you wish you looked like instead. And so you're comparing those two things and finding the actuality of it to be the less preferable one. So how to go about making a better relationship with your body. Lots of specifics there, depending on the specific things that you're struggling with. But in general, what we can say is you're trying to bring those two things more closely in line with each other, the reality of what your body is and your mental either perception of what it is or what you want it to be. Bring them more in line. And yeah, one way of doing that is to work on your body to make it more in line with what you want. Like we were talking about problems. And there's good stuff there, being healthy and whatever. There's also a lot of danger there in people trying to manipulate their body more than, we're talking about eating disorders and that kind of stuff. Of course, in gender dysphoria stuff, there's all types of processes and procedures that you can engage in to change your body to come more in line with what it is that you think of yourself as or want yourself to be. You can also look at the other side. And again, different specifics, different things. I'm definitely not saying that people with gender dysphoria should just change what their image of themselves are. But depending on what your issue is with your body, that might be a way to do it. And one thing that will almost always help with that is to the ability that you're able to tolerate it, engage with the reality of your body more than you currently are, so that your awareness of what you look like becomes more in line. Even if you still want to look different, seeing yourself won't be as much of a shock. Now, you're saying you don't like looking at yourself. So that doesn't mean sit there and stare at yourself no matter how bad you feel. It just means practice within your tolerance, right? That the more you engage, and it doesn't have to be visual either. If you engage in things that activate your body and bring you into your body, same with the diarrhea, by the way, to whatever extent it is caused by the anxiety, it's likely that part of that is because what's happening up here is engaging biological processes that have that effect, whether it's adrenaline or whatever, right? So if we pull you out of here and into the present environment more, theoretically that will help. So you come up with, mindfulness practices or yoga, or again, back to the engage in areas of interest. Pick something that you enjoy doing. Like I've been making the costume for my son out of EVA foam. That requires me to pay attention and not think too much, or painting little miniatures, or drawing or doodling, or fidgeting or stimming, or whatever kinds of things that draw you into the moment more. Over time, hopefully your image of your body becomes more accurate, but that may not be a solution for you. It's general.
It's got me thinking about, now that there's more medical research on it, the tie between stress and anxiety and actually how our immune systems function and how it can misfire as well. Of course, I'm not a doctor. I'm not dispensing any medical advice, but I mean, there's immune disorders that can cause, body dysfunction, psoriasis, Crohn's, things like that.
Crohn's for sure.
Yeah.
I'll say, and again, same caveat, not a doctor at all, but a correlation that I notice. I don't know if it exists statistically. This is anecdotal, but it does seem to be that there is a correlation between chronic disorders, either chronic pain or chronic fatigue disorders, or especially like connective tissue disorders, and neurodivergence, in one form or another. I don't know that that's true. It just seems that way. And when I see a thing, I then start telling stories about it. And this is one of the stories that helps it make sense to me, is if potentially what that means is more of my resources are going towards the intellectual, the cognitive, and less are going towards the observation of my body. Like my 5-year-old and my 2-year-old are both dyspraxic. My 2-year-old didn't start to learn to walk until he was 2 years and 4 months old, something like that, which is later than it usually happens. They have low muscle tone. They also have digestive issues that we got to get going in a minute, so I'll be fast. If we divide the brain into 3 categories, the autonomic, the conscious, the autonomic being all the things that we do without paying attention, including, yes, heartbeats and whatever, but also when I say I'm going to speak, I don't consciously think of like how to move my tongue and vibrate my throat. That stuff all happens autonomically. The conscious, where I, yes, think and have intention. And then executive functioning, which is what theoretically encodes conscious intention for execution by the body. That's why we call it executive functioning. It helps you to execute. So if I say, I'm going to walk to the end of the hall and I trip and fall, that's a failure of executive functioning. That whatever data my body needed to observe in order, and then whatever way it encoded instructions and sent signals from the brain to the muscles and whatever, didn't account for something, or there was some glitch and I tripped and fell. The dyspraxia, that's why we consider it a neurodivergent condition, is the idea is that the body structures seem to be fine, right? The muscles are built the way we expect them to, and the ligaments, but the nervous system, the signals from the brain to those things, to the body, for some reason seem to be doing it in ways that are not optimal. Like very common signs of dyspraxia will be things like people who push much harder than is necessary to write, or grind their teeth, that there are unintentional autonomic signals being sent. And yeah, the digestive system, everything in your body requires signals from the brain to operate. So it is possible that there is some glitch in the way that your brain is autonomically kind of trying to instruct your digestive system to do its thing. Is that true? I don't know, but it explains a correlation that I've noticed. So it's fun to play with, I guess.
Yeah, for a second there, just to put it into my own words, I thought that you were trying to say that the reason why walking was delayed was that your children were trying to solve the problem of locomotion purely cognitively, but it's more about the connection between the brain and the...
Well, yes, and maybe also the other thing. If you look into the research about executive functioning, the vast majority of it takes place in occupational therapy, which I know from having my children be in occupational therapy. A big part of what they do is called motor planning, that we are showing your body the process of how to do this thing by physically, moving your arms and whatever, so that your brain can observe the motion and then encode it. So in a sense, it is, or can be at least, helpful to take a process that we kind of think of normally as just developing automatically and turn it into a cognitive thing. In fact, what we were talking about earlier, the why, could be considered in a similar way, that the things that we just assume people will naturally develop, for some reason, it's not happening with you unless we give you a cognitive kind of framework to hang it on. So I don't know which is which. I can say my 5-year-old and 2-year-old are both very language focused, very charming, unusually so. Or at least that's, not just my opinion, but we get comments about that because everybody thinks that about their kids. But how much of that is impacted by the fact that the 2-year-old was not as physically independent at an earlier age, and therefore was, when he had a problem that needed resolving, was more likely to find a solution by asking or getting someone else to help him than by being able to do it physically on his own? I don't know. Is there a correlation between this and neurodivergence generally? I don't know, but it's fun to think about.
Well, thanks for letting me hang out for this hour of This Is Not Therapy hour. Like you said earlier, we'll eventually think about some ideas for season 2 of Effective Artistry podcast. But I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break here. So those of you guys are obviously not here for me. You're here for Braden. But I wanted to say my gratitude of having me here. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and yeah, come back. I'm here for you. It's more fun for me with you here. And we'll talk more. We still have a couple interviews left with the podcast, and we'll do more in the future. But thank you for being here today.
All right.
All right,
It's good hanging out. Thanks
yeah,
for coming.
We'll talk more soon. Bye, everyone.